The great hall glows with flickering candlelight, casting long, dancing shadows across wooden beams and stone walls. The scent of roasting meats mingles with the sharp tang of spilled ale, while minstrels' songs weave softly through the chatter of lords, ladies, and servants alike. Amid the laughter, the clatter of plates and the occasional squawk of a stray goose remind us that medieval feasts were anything but gentle affairs. Welcome, dear listener, to a quiet journey back to a time when grand celebrations could be as perilous as they were extravagant. Tonight, we'll wander through the bustling chaos of a medieval wedding feast, exploring the strange foods, curious customs, and unexpected dangers that awaited every guest. From drunken brawls to draughty halls, and from overcooked meats to feuds reigniting mid-meal, there are hidden stories behind every clink of a cup. So, snuggle in, let the warmth of history wrap around you, and drift into the curious, sometimes shocking world of medieval celebration. If you enjoy these nighttime tales, feel free to like, subscribe, or share your thoughts in the comments. It's all part of our gentle historical adventure. The beginning of a medieval wedding feast was marked by a moment of quiet anticipation, a hush that spread across the gathered crowd, as though the air itself were holding its breath. It was the entrance of the bride and groom, the ceremonial passage from ordinary life into the stage of married union, and it carried with it a weight far greater than the footsteps of two people. In those dimly lit halls or outside the churchyard, every detail was watched with a mixture of curiosity, awe, and judgment. The bride did not wear white, for the colour carried no special association with purity at the time. Instead, she appeared draped in deep shades of crimson, blue, or even gold, depending on what her family could afford. These colours shimmered faintly in the candlelight, heavy fabrics whispering against the floor with each step. Sometimes threads of gilt or small beads caught the light, creating the impression of a figure who seemed to shine as she moved slowly toward the centre of attention. Her dress was not merely clothing, it was a visible declaration of her family's wealth, status, and pride, meant as much for display as for devotion. The groom too carried signs of his household. His tunic, often of wool dyed in costly pigments or lined with fur, told its own story of standing and aspiration. A finely worked belt, perhaps with a knife or small dagger hanging from it, gleamed at his side, not intended for use but as a marker of dignity. When he entered, flanked by kin and companions, the movement of boots against stone or packed earth echoed through the hall. For the watching crowd, these small details mattered: the cut of a sleeve, the glint of metal, the fabric of the shoes. A wedding was as much a public performance as it was a private union. The sounds of the moment blended, together in layers. Church bells still seemed to linger in memory, their iron tongues having called people to witness the solemn vows earlier. Now, voices shifted into murmurs and hushed remarks, women commenting softly on the bride's embroidery, men weighing the worth of the groom's attire. The shuffling of benches, the creak of wooden floors, and the faint crackle of torches along the walls all created a background music against which the couple moved. Children pushed forward to see better, their eyes wide, their laughter half stifled by the adults who tried to maintain order. The air was filled with the faint scent of smoke from the torches, mingling with the sharper smell of rushes or herbs that had been strewn across the ground to freshen the hall. Each step of the bride and groom seemed deliberate, unhurried, as though they carried not just themselves but the expectations of families, villages, and even entire communities upon their shoulders. For the guests, this entrance was more than spectacle. It was a signal that the feast could truly begin, that the long day of ritual and formality was now sliding into the realm of celebration. But it was also a time of subtle rivalry, for many eyes were keen, searching for flaws, for a misplaced stitch in the dress, for a belt not polished enough, for some detail that might later become the subject of whispered gossip. Yet, in that suspended moment, before food and wine, before music and laughter, the atmosphere was strangely calm. The bride's veil caught the faintest current of air, shifting like a quiet wave. The groom's hand adjusted the edge of his cloak. Two figures, no longer merely individuals but now the centre of a public story, walked slowly into a hall that seemed to breathe with them. The feast, with all its noise and chaos, waited just ahead. But for now, there was only the slow rhythm of steps, the glow of candles on fabric, and the soft murmur of a crowd watching a new beginning unfold. Before the bride and groom could even reach the long tables waiting with food and drink, there was the church, and within it, the weight of ritual. A medieval wedding was not simply a joyous celebration, but a sacred contract, witnessed not just by families and neighbours, but by God and the saints themselves. And so, before the feast could begin, the hours of ritual and blessing unfolded slowly, step by step, as though time itself had been stretched. The church, often cool and dim, was lit by flickering candles and the pale light that slipped through stained glass windows or narrow slits in the stone walls. The scent of incense hung in the air, heavy and sweet, clinging to fabric and hair, creating a kind of dreamlike haze. Guests shifted on wooden benches, their bodies stiff from the cold and the stillness, yet no one dared complain openly. The ceremony was long and everyone knew it. The priest's voice rose and fell in Latin, a language most could not understand but had heard enough to recognize. To the villagers, the words were mysterious, distant, and yet powerful. Each phrase carried the authority of the church, reminding all present that marriage was not merely a social arrangement, but a holy vow. The prayers rolled out slowly, carefully pronounced, echoing faintly against the stone walls. Time seemed to thicken inside the building, every moment lingering a little too long. The rituals themselves were layered and detailed, rings blessed and handed over, vows spoken aloud, the binding of hands with a strip of cloth to symbolize unity. There was holy water sprinkled on the couple, sometimes so liberally that droplets clung to the bride's veil, or darkened the fabric of the groom's tunic. Each action was performed with deliberate slowness, as though the sacredness depended on the very pace of the ritual. To the watching guests it felt endless, like a path winding on and on without an end in sight. Children fidgeted, too young to grasp the meaning, their small voices hushed by stern looks. Older men and women whispered quietly, trying not to draw the priest's attention, their thoughts drifting already to the feast that awaited. The cold crept into feet and hands, and some shifted uneasily, pulling cloaks tighter around their shoulders. And yet the ceremony went on. The blessings came in waves, one after another. A prayer for fertility, a prayer for health, a prayer for peace between families. The priest lifted his hand again and again, tracing the sign of the cross in the air, each gesture solemn and deliberate. At times the chanting of the congregation rose faintly, a low hum filling the church like the sound of distant bees. It was not joyful singing, but something slower, steadier, meant to remind the living of eternity. For the bride and groom this was a trial of patience as much as devotion. Their hands, bound together, grew warm and slightly uncomfortable. Their knees ached from standing and kneeling again. Yet their faces remained composed, for every glance, every movement, was being observed. To falter here would be to show weakness, and weakness had no place in the eyes of the crowd. At last, after what seemed like hours, the final blessing was given. The priest's voice, tired but firm, echoed one last time, and the congregation crossed themselves with weary reverence. The bells outside began to ring again, sharp and joyful, announcing to the village that the union had been sealed. The couple, solemn yet relieved, stepped out of the cool dimness into the open air, where light and sound seemed suddenly brighter, sharper, freer. It was the moment everyone had waited for. The slow, heavy ritual was behind them, and the promise of music, laughter, and overflowing tables lay just ahead. But even as they moved toward the feast, the memory of the long hours in the church lingered, a reminder that joy in the medieval world was never separate from solemn duty. As the long hours of ritual finally gave way to the freedom of movement, the bride and groom stepped out of the church and into a world where every eye was fixed upon them. This was the moment when the weight of ceremony melted into spectacle, when the union was not only declared but displayed, like a painting come to life. Clothing, jewels, and crowns were more than decoration here. They were messages written in fabric and metal, read by everyone present, whether noble or commoner. The bride's gown, already glimpsed in the dim light of the church, shone more fully in the open air. The rich fabric caught the brightness of day or the shimmer of torchlight, depending on the season, and every fold seemed alive with colour. Crimson spoke of vitality and wealth, deep blue of loyalty and faith, while golden thread declared abundance without words. The dress itself was heavy, layered and stitched with care, making every step a measured effort. Yet the strain was hidden behind a veil of grace, for the gown was not meant for comfort, it was meant for admiration. Around her neck hung a chain, perhaps of silver or, in richer houses, of gold, sometimes adorned with a small pendant set with coloured glass or even a gem. Ears carried drops of polished stone, while the delicate shimmer of rings decorated fingers already bound by the band of marriage. A crown or circlet might rest upon her hair, not a queenly diadem, but a symbol nonetheless, often of silver gilt, decorated with small details that reflected her family's standing. Even flowers, woven into hair or pinned to the gown, spoke of care, fertility, and the promise of new beginnings. The groom was no less a figure of display. His tunic, trimmed with fur or edged with embroidered thread, revealed the effort his household had poured into this day. Belts of worked leather, sometimes with bits of metal or polished fittings, marked him as a man of stature. Boots were newly cleaned, cloaks freshly dyed, and the subtle glint of a small dagger at the side hinted not at violence, but at nobility. For the guests, these small things mattered deeply. They were signals of honour, status, and the seriousness with which the family approached the marriage alliance. What made the display even more powerful was that it was communal. Every guest became part of this spectacle by their own attire. Women wore their best wool or linen dresses, often dyed in shades they could afford, with simple brooches to hold them together. Men wore tunics freshly brushed, sometimes with borrowed pieces to look finer than usual. Even children, though restless, were dressed neatly, for they too represented their families. The hall or churchyard became a tapestry of colour and texture, each thread contributing to the larger picture. The sensory atmosphere was overwhelming. Cloth rustled as people shifted closer to glimpse the couple. Metal gleamed, polished hastily for this day, catching the eye as it moved in the light. Jewels, whether real or glass, sparkled faintly, their colours alive in the glow of fire or sunlight. The faint scent of perfume, rare and precious, drifted from the bride, mingling with the simpler smell of herbs tucked into hair or pinned to cloaks by other women. This parade of appearance was not vanity alone. In the medieval world, outward display was proof of inward truth. Fine clothing meant strong families, jewels hinted at security, crowns and circlets suggested dignity. To lack these things was to risk being whispered about, judged quietly by neighbours who would carry their impressions home and repeat them for years. A wedding was therefore both a promise and a performance, one where silence or simplicity could feel almost like failure. As the couple walked forward, hands occasionally brushing against jewels or the edges of their garments, they did so knowing that each step was part of a silent dialogue with the crowd. They were being measured not just as two people, but as representatives of entire families and their fortunes. The feast was waiting, with its noise and chaos, but in that moment of quiet admiration and scrutiny, the couple shone as brightly as the jewels they wore. Once the ceremonial entrance had ended, and the couple had taken their places of honour, the guests followed, streaming into the hall or gathering beneath great canopies if the wedding was held outdoors. What awaited them was not just a meal, but a rare moment when the boundaries of society softened, if only for a night. Medieval life was divided sharply: lords and peasants, merchants and labourers, clergy and common folk. But at a wedding feast, all of these layers were drawn together under one roof filled with noise, food, and expectation. The high table, placed at the end of the hall on a raised platform, belonged to the newly married couple, their parents, and the most important of the guests. Here, the cloth was cleanest, the silverware shone brightest, and the food would arrive in greater variety. Goblets might be of metal rather than wood, pitchers carved with detail rather than plain. The bride and groom, seated at the centre, were framed like figures in a painting, their garments glowing in the firelight, their faces lit by both ceremony and the attention of the room. But beyond the high table stretched row upon row of benches and boards, where guests of every standing sat shoulder to shoulder. Lords and stewards, merchants who had travelled from nearby towns, and villagers who worked the fields all shared the same space. It was not equality, not in the modern sense, for some were served first, and their portions were richer. Yet the nearness itself was striking. A farmer might find himself across from a knight, a washerwoman beside a bailiff, each holding the same rough loaf of bread or drinking from a shared pitcher of ale. The hall grew thick with sound. The scraping of benches against stone, the laughter of men who rarely spoke together, the rustle of dresses as women leaned forward to talk, the soft cries of children, all joined into one restless music. Servants hurried up and down the rows, balancing trenchers, pouring ale and carving meat in portions, their arms aching from the weight and the repetition. Every guest, no matter how lowly, was fed, for the abundance of food was itself a sign of the family's honour. The mingling of classes brought its own fascination. Villagers, unused to such settings, stared in awe at the jewelled rings or bright fabrics of the wealthier guests. Nobles, in turn, sometimes looked with curiosity or amusement at the rough manners of peasants, their hands clumsy with the food, their laughter unrestrained. The feast became a theatre of observation, each group watching the other, learning, judging, or quietly resenting. And yet, in the haze of torchlight and the shared rhythm of eating, there was also a sense of unity. Ale loosened tongues. Bread passed from hand to hand bridged the distance between lives that rarely touched. For one evening, the walls of class seemed thinner, if not gone, and the hall was filled with a noisy, chaotic fellowship that could not exist in the strict routines of daily life. The sensory atmosphere was overwhelming. Smoke from torches curled upward, carrying the smell of tallow mixed with roasting meat. Rushes on the floor crackled underfoot as guests shifted. The air grew heavy with the warmth of bodies pressed close, the scent of wool and leather mingling with spices sprinkled into the dishes. Candles flickered, catching briefly on a silver cup here, a golden buckle there, before sinking back into shadow. For the bride and groom, seated above it all, the sight was both a triumph and a reminder of responsibility. Their union had brought together these many layers of society, at least for a night, and the gathering itself was a display of power, wealth, and connection. Yet for the guests, what mattered was simpler: the chance to sit at a table laden with food, to share in laughter, to speak more freely than usual. And so, in that long hall, high-born and low-born alike leaned over the same tables, their voices mingling into a single tide of sound. It was messy, imperfect, sometimes tense, but it was also a glimpse of something rare, a world momentarily less divided, joined in the promise of celebration. The hall, once carefully arranged with tables and benches, quickly transformed into something far less orderly once the guests had settled. At first there was only the low murmur of conversation, the cautious shifting of feet and benches as everyone found a place. But soon the sound grew louder, layered upon itself until the air seemed thick with it. Noise was the natural language of a medieval wedding feast, constant, unrestrained, and impossible to escape. Children released from the stillness of the church darted between legs and benches, their laughter ringing out above the deeper voices of the adults. They shouted, tumbled, and were scolded half-heartedly, only to break free again, their small feet thudding across the rush-covered floor. Dogs, drawn in by the promise of scraps, added their own voices, barking sharply when a piece of meat fell, or when they jostled against one another under the tables. The sound of animals mingled with the squeals of children, each competing with the other for attention. Above this rose the hearty laughter of men already warmed by ale. Tankards were lifted, spilled, and filled again, each toast louder than the last. Jokes were shouted across the long tables, and stories retold with ever more exaggerated gestures. The clang of knives against trenchers, the tearing of bread, and the steady pouring of drink created a background rhythm, like a drumbeat marking the passage of the night. For those unused to such gatherings, it was overwhelming, a tide of voices that never ebbed. Servants wove in and out of this chaos, their trays heavy with food, their arms aching. The crash of a dropped dish or the clatter of a jug added sudden bursts of sound, followed by laughter or groans from the tables. Commands were shouted at them, more bread here, more ale there, as though one voice could rise above the hundreds. Their hurried steps echoed on the floors, a frantic counterpoint to the slower movements of those seated. Confusion was inevitable. Guests arrived late, searching for spaces where none remained. Some pressed too close together, their elbows knocking, their tempers flaring in small bursts of irritation. At times, a seat meant for one family was claimed by another, sparking muttered arguments that simmered under the noise. Strangers sat side by side trying to be polite, while behind them others whispered about who should or should not have been invited at all. The sensory detail of the moment was overpowering. Smoke from dozens of torches curled upward, carrying the sharp smell of burning tallow that clung to hair and fabric. The scent of roasted meat, pungent herbs, and spilled ale filled the air, heavy and heady. Combined with the crush of bodies, the room grew warm, almost stifling, so that faces flushed and foreheads glistened in the candlelight. The sound of laughter, barking, children's cries, and the constant scrape of benches created a wall of noise through which no single voice could be heard clearly. And yet, despite the confusion, there was an energy in it that carried the feast forward. The chaos was not disorder in the sense of collapse, but rather a living, breathing sign of abundance. Silence would have been unthinkable, even unsettling. The very messiness of it, the spills, the noise, the shouts, was part of the joy, part of the proof that life was being celebrated in its fullest. Still, for anyone unaccustomed to such gatherings, the experience could be overwhelming, almost unbearable. To step into that hall was to surrender to the tide of humanity, to accept that personal space and quiet would not return until the candles burned low and the voices finally faded. Until then, the noise and confusion reigned, a storm of sound beneath a roof meant to hold the weight of joy. In the swirl of voices, the endless movement of servants, and the distractions of food and drink, it was easy for faces to blur. Not every guest seated at the long tables had been invited, and not every figure who slipped through the doors belonged to the families of bride or groom. Medieval weddings, especially those held in large halls or churchyards, were not private affairs in the modern sense. They drew the attention of entire villages, neighbouring parishes, and even wandering strangers who lived by the chance of such occasions. The threshold of the hall became a porous border. At first only the expected guests passed through, kin and allies, neighbours and lords. But as the night deepened, unfamiliar figures began to arrive, moving in with quiet confidence. A man with mud still on his boots found a place near the hearth, as though he had always belonged. A pair of women whispered together at the far end of the bench, their eyes darting to the serving trays with a hunger that revealed more than their silence. Few noticed, for who could keep track of so many? These uninvited guests often came with simple motives. The scent of roasted goose and spiced pottage carried through the village streets, and to those who lived on little more than bread and broth, such aromas were too tempting to resist. A feast meant abundance, and abundance meant opportunity. If one slipped into the crowd at just the right moment, a trencher of meat or a cup of ale might be obtained before anyone thought to ask a name. Hunger, after all, cared little for ceremony. Yet not all intruders were driven by need alone. Some came for amusement, the chance to watch, to gossip, to carry tales from one household to another. A stranger in the shadows could listen to the drunken boasts of men, or observe the secret glances exchanged between young women and men already promised elsewhere. Others came with darker intentions, ready to lift a silver spoon, a jewelled clasp, or even a purse left too carelessly on a bench. The chaos of the feast offered perfect cover for a quick hand. For the hosts, it was nearly impossible to tell who belonged. Names were not checked at the door, nor could every cousin or ally be recognised in a hall lit only by torchlight. Suspicion lingered, but confrontation was rare. To accuse someone wrongly would be more embarrassing than to let them eat in peace. So the intruders sat, ate, and blended, sometimes leaving before they were noticed, sometimes remaining until the final candles burned low. The atmosphere shifted with their presence, though few could say how. A sudden tension in conversation, a wary glance at a stranger's cloak, or the quiet realization that a familiar face was nowhere to be found. These subtle signs hinted that not everyone belonged. In such moments laughter softened, and a murmur of unease ran beneath the louder voices. The joy of the wedding feast was always shadowed by this uncertainty, the knowledge that the hall held more than friends and kin, and yet there was a strange acceptance of it too. In a world where food was scarce and gatherings rare, the idea that outsiders might join was not entirely unwelcome. To feed the hungry could be seen as a blessing, a chance to earn favour in the eyes of God. A stranger at the table might be tolerated, even ignored, so long as they caused no trouble. But behind this tolerance lurked a quieter truth. The boundary between celebration and danger was always thin, and in the press of bodies, no one could truly know who sat beside them. The feast, in its noise and confusion, became a place of blurred lines, between kin and stranger, invited and uninvited, welcome and unwelcome. It was a reminder that even on nights of joy, shadows slipped in with the light, and the hall was never as secure as it seemed. As the tables groaned under the weight of trenchers, platters, and steaming pots, the air was filled with the heavy sense of meat and bread. Yet among the familiar dishes, roasted pork, mutton stew, thick loaves of rye, there appeared from time to time food so rare and unusual that they drew murmurs of awe from the guests. These were the delicacies, the treasures of the feast, meant not for nourishment but for display, to declare the wealth and status of those hosting the celebration. A swan, its white feathers plucked and then carefully reattached to its roasted body, was carried in with solemn pride. Its neck curved elegantly, its head raised as if still alive, its skin brushed with saffron and gold leaf so that it shimmered in the candlelight. Few would dare eat it. Its flesh was tough, almost bitter. But that was never the point. To bring forth a swan was to announce power, to remind every eye in the hall that such extravagance was possible here, in this family, on this night. Beside it might come a peacock, presented in similar fashion, its radiant feathers fanned wide, its body roasted and spiced. Like the swan, it was not beloved for taste but for spectacle. Servants struggled to balance the weight of the bird as they carried it to the high table, where it would sit as both a dish and an ornament. Children stared wide-eyed, their laughter silenced for a moment, while the humbler guests whispered among themselves about the cost, about how many fields of grain such a bird could equal. Other rarities came not from forests or rivers, but from faraway lands. Trays of candied fruits, sticky with honey, glistened under the flickering torches. Oranges, their bright skins unlike anything grown in northern soil, were sliced and passed to the most honoured guests, their sharp fragrance cutting through the heavy smell of meat. Spices too, cinnamon, cloves and nutmeg, were sprinkled into sauces and wines, their warmth filling the mouth in ways that felt almost magical. Every pinch of spice was costly, a treasure brought across seas and mountains, guarded by merchants and weighed against silver. For those seated at the lower benches, such delights were glimpsed only at a distance. A servant might carry a jewelled plate of marzipan past them, the almond scent drifting close before disappearing into the crowd near the Lord's table. If they were lucky, a small portion might be passed down at the end, when the important guests had already chosen what they wished. More often, however, the rarest delicacies never reached them at all. The feast was a world divided, abundance for some, plain bread and broth for others, and yet even those who never tasted the swan or the sugared almonds remembered their presence. To see such food was to be reminded of wealth beyond imagining, of distant lands and merchants' caravans, of nobles who could command such wonders with a word. It was a performance as much as a meal, a play in which food became language, speaking of rank, fortune, and ambition. The hall itself seemed to lean into this drama. Candles reflected off golden saucers, jewels sparkled beside shining platters, and the scent of spice clung to the air like incense. The hum of voices deepened into murmurs of awe, for even in the chaos and noise these moments of extravagance stood apart, unforgettable. And when the platters were finally cleared, when the swan and peacock had been carved or merely admired, a silence lingered in memory. The rare delicacies, however briefly seen or tasted, became the markers of the night, the things retold in stories for weeks afterward. They were not just food, but symbols, proof that this wedding feast was no ordinary gathering, but an event set apart, shining in its extravagance before fading back into the ordinary hunger of daily life. For most people of the Middle Ages, the taste of daily life was simple, even monotonous. A bowl of pottage, vegetables, grains, and perhaps a scrap of meat if fortune allowed, was the foundation of countless meals. Bread, often dense and coarse, carried them through the day, washed down with ale that was more nourishment than indulgence. Salt and a handful of local herbs gave some variation, but the palate of an ordinary villager rarely wandered far. Hunger was a constant companion, and meals were meant to sustain, not to delight. That was why the wedding feast felt like stepping into another world. The flavours here, rich and layered, bore little resemblance to the steady diet of peasant homes. From the first bite, the senses were awakened by combinations rarely tasted. Meats infused with herbs not usually wasted on common fare, sauces brightened with imported spices, and sweets glazed with honey so generously it seemed a dream. A roasted boar, for instance, might arrive at the table glistening, its skin crisp and seasoned with rosemary, sage and thyme. For villagers used to thin broth with a faint hint of onion, such fragrant herbs transformed the very air they breathed. Each slice was a revelation, savoury, aromatic, and impossible to forget. Alongside it came venison stewed with wine, a richness entirely absent from the everyday life of farmers who rarely saw meat except on feast days. The dark, earthy flavours lingered, coating the tongue in a way plain bread never could. The sauces themselves became small wonders. Almond milk thickened into creamy bases, sharpened with vinegar or sweetened with raisins. Dishes were coloured with saffron, turning them golden, or with parsley, giving them a vibrant green hue. Even the appearance of food astonished, for most meals at home were pale and plain. To taste a sauce that combined sweet fruit with sharp spice was to encounter something new, almost unsettling, a reminder that food could be art, not only survival. For many guests, the greatest marvel came in the form of sweetness. Sugar was a luxury, rarer than gold for most, and yet here it appeared in pastries and candied fruits. Almonds were ground into marzipan, moulded into shapes of birds or flowers, their delicate sweetness dissolving softly on the tongue. Honey dripped thick and golden over nuts, cakes, and even roasted roots. Such flavours were so foreign to the daily rhythm of salted porridge and plain bread that they seemed almost otherworldly, a fleeting glimpse into paradise. Even the drinks told a different story. Ale was still poured in abundance, but wine, red, spiced and warming, circulated among the honoured tables. A sip of mulled wine, infused with cinnamon and cloves, carried the drinker far beyond the reach of their familiar fields, into visions of distant lands and caravans winding across deserts. For a villager it was less a drink and more an encounter with mystery. The contrast was so sharp that it almost unsettled the senses. To eat such food was to realise, if only briefly, how narrow daily life had been. The tongue, dulled by years of sameness, came alive with every new bite. The mind, used to thinking of food as necessity, began to wonder at its power as pleasure, and when the feast ended, when the platters were cleared and the flavours faded, the memory lingered like a dream that could not be fully shaken. The wedding feast, then, was not only a celebration of union, but of abundance, of taste itself. For many it was the one time in a year, or perhaps a lifetime, when food rose above hunger and became something else entirely. The flavours of that night, so unlike the daily meals of the medieval world, became stories to be retold, tastes to be remembered long after the bread and pottage returned. Among all the wonders of the feast, none astonished the senses more than the sudden and dazzling presence of spices. To most villagers, the word spice meant little more than the bitter bite of mustard seed, or the sharpness of garlic, ingredients they could grow or gather themselves. But here, in the glow of torchlight, dishes appeared touched by faraway lands. Cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, saffron, cloves, pepper. Each grain and fragment had travelled across seas and deserts, guarded on long journeys, worth more than their weight in silver. Their very presence was proof of wealth, and their taste was nothing short of revelation. The first surprise was in the meats. Pork, usually salted and tough, was here softened by cooking in wine and sweetened with prunes, then laced with cinnamon. The tongue, accustomed to salt and broth, could hardly make sense of the warmth of spice mingling with the sweetness of fruit. Venison appeared, rich and dark, simmered in sauces brightened by cloves and ginger. Even fish, brought from nearby rivers or ponds, was transformed by a dusting of pepper or a golden wash of saffron, so that it gleamed like sunlight on water. Stranger still were the combinations. Sweetness and sharpness danced together on the same dish, as though opposites had been deliberately joined. Almond milk thickened into creamy sauces, then poured, over meat. Raisins floated in vinegar-bright stews. Sugar was scattered over roasted roots. To a guest used to the simple divide of savoury and sweet, these minglings seemed almost unsettling, and yet once tasted they lingered in memory. Food no longer obeyed familiar rules. It became something new, a conversation between lands and flavours far beyond the village horizon. The colours, too, carried their own wonder. Saffron turned dishes into golden pools, glowing like treasure under the candles. Ground parsley and spinach gave a fresh green tint to sauces, while rare spices like sandalwood painted food with shades of red. The very sight of it was part of the theatre, designed to delight and impress. Eating became more than nourishment. It became spectacle, a performance for the eyes as well as the tongue. Wine, mulled with cinnamon and cloves, added warmth that spread through the body, deeper than ordinary ale ever could. It was heady, perfumed, and rich, its fragrance rising before the first sip even touched the lips. For many it was almost overwhelming, a flood of sensation where before there had only been the steady rhythm of coarse bread and mild ale. The strangeness of these spices lay not only in their flavours but in their stories. Each one carried with it the memory of far-off lands, of caravans moving across deserts, of merchants sailing stormy seas, of markets filled with goods from worlds unseen. To taste a spoonful of nutmeg was to touch, however faintly, the distance between village and empire, between the humble hearth and the vast, mysterious world beyond. Not all guests embraced these unfamiliar combinations. Some wrinkled their noses, declaring that meat ought to taste like meat, not honey. Others whispered that such extravagance was unnatural, even sinful, that food should not be dressed in colours and scents better suited to the church altar. And yet curiosity often triumphed, and even the most doubtful tongues gave in, discovering pleasures they had never imagined. The memory of those spices lingered long after the feast was over. For days, perhaps weeks, villagers would recall the warmth of cinnamon on pork, the brightness of saffron, the odd sweetness of fruit married to meat. It was a reminder that food could be strange, enchanting, and deeply powerful, a taste of the extraordinary hidden inside an ordinary world. Beneath all the splendour of the feast, the glowing torches, the fragrant spices, the shining platters, there lingered an unspoken reality that few dared to name aloud. For as much as the food dazzled the eye, its journey to the table was often uncertain, and the standards of preservation and hygiene were far from the expectations of modern minds. What appeared rich and abundant could in truth be dangerous, a hidden threat lurking beneath the surface of celebration. Meat was the most vulnerable. In the absence of ice or modern storage, it depended on salt, smoke, or the coolness of cellars to survive more than a day. A boar roasted at the feast might have been freshly slaughtered, but it might also have lingered for days in less than ideal conditions, hung in a smokehouse where flies found their way, or kept in barrels where the salt only half masked the scent of decay. Guests, warmed by wine and laughter, seldom paused to question the freshness of each bite. Yet now and then a strange tang in the flavour hinted at age, and some diners shifted uneasily as they chewed. Fish, too, carried its risks. Fresh when caught from a river that very morning it might be safe, even delicate. But fish brought from afar, packed in salt or dried stiff, could hide more than it revealed. If rehydrated poorly, it brought with it the sourness of rot. And those sources of spice, vinegar, or almond milk masked these notes. The body would discover them later, in the uneasy hours after the feast, when the torches had dimmed and the laughter was gone. Even bread, that humble staple, could carry quiet dangers. Grain stored in damp conditions grew mould, and flour sometimes harboured insects or grit. The lower tables were often served the coarser loaves, darker and heavier, with bits of husk or even small stones ground into the dough. A careless bite could crack a tooth as easily as it filled a stomach. No one complained. It was bread, after all, and bread was life. But the experience was far removed from the fresh white loaves served at the high table. Hygiene was no kinder. Servants, rushing between kitchen and hall, had little chance to wash hands in clean water. The same knives carved one dish after another, wiped hastily on cloths already stained. Cups were passed from hand to hand, and it was not uncommon for a guest to drink from a vessel touched by dozens before him. Dogs roamed freely under the tables, their paws tracking in mud, sometimes snapping at scraps that fell, sometimes nosing against the very trenches from which guests ate. Water itself was not trusted, for it so often carried sickness, so ale and wine were safer. Yet in the preparation of food, water could not be avoided, used to wash herbs, to soften dried fish, to boil grains. If drawn from a stream fouled upstream by animals or waste, it carried unseen dangers. The torchlight and the music hid these risks for the moment, but the days after a feast sometimes revealed them, when illness spread, quietly through households that had all shared from the same table, and still none of this dimmed the joy in the moment. The guests ate eagerly, for the abundance of food was itself a wonder, and any danger seemed small beside the chance to taste what they might never taste again. They laughed as they tore bread, as they dipped into sauces, as they raised their cups. The shadows of hygiene and preservation hung unseen, felt only in the uneasy whispers of the body afterward, when the feast had ended. Thus the medieval wedding table was a paradox, dazzling in its variety, rich in spectacle, yet shadowed always by the quiet risks of its world. It was abundance and danger, beauty and frailty, mingled together under the same roof, as inseparable as joy and sorrow in the rhythm of medieval life. For all its grandeur, a medieval wedding feast carried with it a quiet, invisible shadow. Beneath the laughter, the toasts and the gleaming platters, there lurked the possibility that the food so generously served could also be the very cause of suffering. Food poisoning, though unnamed in those days, was a fate many knew well. It arrived silently, spreading through households after great gatherings, a reminder that joy and illness so often walked side by side. The causes were many, and they began long before the feast itself. Meat that had lingered too long after slaughter, fish brought from faraway rivers packed in salt and then poorly revived, dairy stored in warm conditions, all could hide dangers beneath their enticing scents and sauces. Spices, so costly and celebrated, often served not only to delight the tongue, but to mask the taste of the age or decay. A dish might appear golden with saffron or rich with cinnamon, yet under the perfume of spice lay flesh already turning. Guests, charmed by the splendour of flavour, would eat without question. The symptoms revealed themselves later, after the torches had dimmed and the hall had fallen quiet. A man who had laughed too loudly at the feast might find himself doubled over in the night, his body racked with cramps. A woman who had tasted for the first time a sugared fruit might spend the morning in weakness, unable to rise from her bed. Whole families sometimes shared the same fate, having eaten from the same trenchers, drunk from the same cups. The joy of the wedding could be followed by days of misery, whispered about in hushed tones across the village. In a time before understanding of bacteria or contamination, such illness was explained in other ways. Some said it was the will of God, a testing of the soul after too much indulgence. Others whispered of curses, of jealous neighbours or angry spirits resentful of the couple's happiness. Still others blamed the very excess of the feast, believing that the body was not meant to handle so much meat, so much wine, so much sugar all at once. Moderation, they said, would have spared them, but moderation was never the spirit of a wedding feast. Not every case was severe. Many endured only a night of discomfort, a reminder of the risks they had chosen to take in pursuit of celebration. But there were darker tales too, a guest weakened by hunger or illness before the feast might not recover from the assault on the stomach. Children, their small bodies unable to withstand the shock, sometimes became gravely ill. In rare but remembered instances, death followed, leaving behind the bitter aftertaste of tragedy amid what should have been joy. Still, the risk never lessened the desire to partake. To refuse food at a wedding was to insult the hosts, to step aside from the very heart of the celebration. And so, even with the memory of past feasts that had ended in sickness, people ate. They dipped bread into sauces, they lifted cups of wine, they bit into meats fragrant with cloves and honey. The chance of joy outweighed the shadow of danger, at least for that night. The memory of such illness lingered, though, woven into the stories told afterward. "Do you remember," someone might say weeks later, "how half the hall was sick after the feast?" And others would nod, laughing gently, as though the suffering had become another tale to add to the long tradition of wedding lore. Food poisoning was not seen as failure, but as part of the rhythm of life, a companion to celebration, a risk that all accepted in order to taste abundance, however fleeting. Thus the medieval wedding table gave both gift and punishment. It offered flavours unlike daily life, wonders from distant lands, the warmth of wine and spice, and it carried too the chance of pain, of weakness, even of death. Both belonged to the same story, inseparable, as much a part of the feast as the laughter and the vows that began it. When one guest at a medieval feast fell ill, it rarely remained the misfortune of a single person. The nature of such gatherings, the shared trenches, the communal cups, the crowded benches pressed shoulder to shoulder, meant that sickness could ripple outward like a stone dropped into water. What began with one man doubled over in the night might by morning be echoed in the homes of many, a silent thread binding the revellers long after the feast had ended. The food itself was often the culprit, for all had eaten from the same dishes. A great pot of stew ladled out to dozens would spread its hidden dangers equally, each spoonful carrying the same unseen flaws. A platter of roasted meat, carved and passed from hand to hand, offered no escape once its freshness had faded. If bread was spoiled or fish tainted, nearly every guest would taste it, their laughter at the table turning within hours to shared suffering. The very abundance of the feast, so dazzling in the torchlight, became the means of spreading misery to all. But food was not the only vessel of contagion. In a world where illness was little understood, the closeness of bodies was itself a risk. Guests pressed together on benches, leaning close to talk, over the noise, their breaths mingling in the smoky air. Cups of ale were passed between friends, sipped and handed on, touched by dozens of mouths in the course of an evening. Children ran freely from table to table, climbing onto laps, smearing their hands on bread and trenchers, carrying with them more than playfulness. What one carried, many would soon carry. The spread of illness was often swift. A headache that seemed harmless at first deepened into fever. A stomach that cramped in the night became weakness that lasted for days. Entire households awoke in misery, unable to work the fields or tend their animals, bound instead to the bed by a sickness that struck with the same suddenness it had spread. In the most severe cases, death followed, quietly, without warning, taking one guest while leaving another only mildly touched. Explanations for such misfortune varied, for the causes were invisible. Some said the feast had been cursed, that jealous neighbours or wandering spirits had poisoned the food. Others whispered of sin, of gluttony punished by divine hand. The connection between shared food, shared drink, and shared illness was sensed but not clearly understood, so stories filled the gaps. Perhaps the swan had not been cooked long enough, perhaps the wine had soured, perhaps an uninvited guest had slipped in with wicked intentions. Every theory was voiced, and yet the truth remained elusive. What could not be denied was the way such illness bound people together, not in joy, but in suffering. A village where half the households were struck after a feast carried the memory for years. "Do you remember that wedding?" they would ask, and the answer was given with grim nods, with stories of nights spent in pain, with recollections of children or elders who had never fully recovered. The memory of celebration was shadowed by the memory of what followed, and yet the pattern repeated itself. Each feast carried the same risk, and each time guests returned willingly to the table, choosing joy despite the possibility of illness. For in a world where life was harsh and uncertain, one night of laughter, abundance, and company was worth even the shadow that might follow. Illness might spread quickly, but so too did stories, laughter, and bonds that endured. Both were part of the feast, inseparable, written into the very fabric of medieval life. No medieval feast was complete without the lifting of goblets, the ritual of toasts that punctuated the long hours of eating and noise. The moment would begin with the master of ceremonies, or perhaps a noble guest, raising his cup high so that the firelight caught its polished rim, and the hall fell, if not into silence, then at least into a murmur. The first toast was always solemn, dedicated to the bride and groom, or to the host whose generosity had filled the tables. The words were lofty, woven with blessings, and yet beneath the reverence lay the anticipation of drink. For as soon as the toast was spoken, the cups were tipped, and the ale or wine flowed into eager throats. The drink itself was part of the spectacle. Wine was not the daily drink of most medieval households. It was costly, often reserved for the nobility, and when it appeared in large quantities at a feast, it was a sign of wealth and magnificence. Ale was more common, brewed in great vats and brought to the tables by servants who struggled beneath the weight of heavy jugs. There was no careful measure of servings. Cups were refilled as soon as they emptied, and the toasts followed one upon the other, each with less formality than the last. Soon, toasts grew less about honour and more about exuberance. One guest toasted the health of the groom, another toasted the bride's beauty, another the endurance of marriage, another simply the quality of the ale. The crowd joined in, lifting their cups again and again, their words less polished but no less heartfelt. Laughter spilled out with the drink, and the goblets, raised too hastily, often sloshed their contents across the rough tables or down the fronts of tunics and gowns. No one minded, for a stain of wine was simply proof of merriment. The abundance of drink carried its own risks, for medieval wine and ale were not gentle. Ale could be thick and strong, brewed without the consistency of modern recipes, its potency unpredictable. Wine, especially when spiced, carried a heady richness that filled the air with its scent and the drinker's head with warmth. Few guests measured their pace, and the act of communal toasting encouraged excess. To refuse a toast was to risk seeming unfriendly, and so each guest drank as the goblets made their rounds, swept along by the tide of expectation. The atmosphere of the hall changed with each toast. At first the noise was cheerful and orderly, voices rising together in blessing. As the hours passed, the rhythm broke apart, each table shouting its own words, some unintelligible, others bawdy. Songs began between toasts, voices weaving unevenly through half-remembered verses, the clatter of cups striking wood as men and women alike beat the rhythm with their hands. The hall, heavy with smoke and torchlight, seemed alive with a restless energy, a whirl of noise and heat in which no single voice could be heard above the rest. Yet there was beauty in it too, for in the chaos of overflowing goblets, there was also a sense of unity. Every class, from noble to servant, lifted their cups together, their voices blending in common cheer. Differences blurred for a moment, drowned in the shared drink, the shared ritual. The goblet passed from hand to hand was a symbol of belonging, and even the poorest guest could feel, for a few hours, as though they were part of something grand. But beneath this unity lay the first hints of disorder, the early signs of what such unending drink could bring. Hands grew unsteady, voices slurred, and laughter turned sharper at the edges. The toasts, once blessings, became challenges, dares shouted across the hall. With every cup emptied and refilled, the night crept closer to the point where merriment would spill over into unruliness. The overflowing goblets were, in many ways, the heartbeat of the feast, warm, abundant, intoxicating. They carried joy, but also the seeds of chaos, and so the guests drank on, knowing little of where the night would carry them, only that it began with raised cups and voices echoing blessings into the smoky air. As the night deepened and the goblets continued to pass from hand to hand, the feast began to lose its early grace. What had started with solemn blessings and warm laughter slowly shifted, like a fire that first glows bright and steady, but then spits sparks and smoke as the wood burns unevenly. The endless rounds of toasts, the heavy ale and strong wine filled the hall not only with merriment, but also with the first cracks of disorder. Voices that had once blended into cheerful noise began to grow sharper, rising above the rest in drunken confidence. At first, the shouting was harmless, guests calling across the tables, laughing at jokes that grew louder with each retelling. Songs became bawdier, verses shouted with pride even when half forgotten. Men leaned across the benches to slap one another's backs with too much force, their laughter echoing like thunder against the stone walls. The hall, filled with heat from bodies and smoke from torches, vibrated with energy that could not be contained. But drink loosens more than tongues. It loosens tempers as well. The quarrels often began over the smallest of things. A guest who jostled another too roughly in his eagerness for meat, a servant who spilled ale onto a nobleman's cloak, or a jest made in good humour that struck too close to pride. In the haze of intoxication, such slights seemed larger than life. Words sharpened, and before long the laughter that had filled the hall gave way to shouts that carried a different tone. Quarrels between guests were not unusual at such feasts. Long-standing rivalries between families or neighbours often simmered beneath the surface, needing only the spark of drink to bring them into the open. A pointed remark might be answered with a boast, the boast with an insult, and the insult with a shove. Soon 2 men were on their feet, shouting so fiercely that the music faltered and the tables around them fell silent, all eyes drawn to the unfolding scene. Sometimes the quarrels ended quickly, soothed by companions who dragged the offenders back to their seats and pressed fresh cups into their hands. But not always. At times, the noise grew until the whole hall seemed split, one group cheering on a fighter, another jeering, the tension feeding itself. Wooden cups were slammed against tables, benches scraped the floor as men stumbled to their feet, and women called out in alarm or laughter, depending on their place in the spectacle. The danger of such quarrels lay not only in raised voices, but in what followed. Knives were common at the tables, carried by nearly every guest, used for cutting meat and bread. A quarrel that began with words could too easily shift towards steel. Feasts that had begun in joy sometimes ended in blood, with the laughter of the evening replaced by the shock of violence. Even when blades remained sheathed, fists might fly, leaving bruises and broken bones as souvenirs of what had been meant to celebrate love and union. And yet, for all the risks, such quarrels were expected, almost woven into the fabric of the feast itself. Hosts prepared for them, placing trusted men nearby to keep order, though often with limited success once the drink had taken hold. Guests too accepted the possibility, shrugging off the memory of quarrels as part of the excess of the occasion. What mattered was not the fight itself, but the feast, the chance to eat, to drink, to shout, and to feel alive, even if tempers boiled over along the way. In the end, the shouting and quarrels were another reminder of the raw, unpolished nature of medieval life. A feast was never simply gentle celebration. It was a gathering of passions, joy, pride, anger, and rivalry, all stirred together and magnified by overflowing goblets. And as the night wore on, the line between merriment and chaos blurred, leaving behind stories that would be told for years of the wedding where laughter and shouting rose together into the smoky night. As the feast stretched deep into the night, the line between celebration and disorder all but vanished. The hall, once alive with songs and laughter, now pulsed with a different rhythm, one born of too much drink and too little restraint. Torches guttered in their brackets, filling the smoky air with wavering shadows. Tables were littered with bones, crumbs, and spilled ale, their once proud platters now reduced to scraps and sticky pools of wine. And amid it all, the guests, unsteady on their feet and unguarded in their manners, surrendered to the chaos of drink. The signs of losing control were everywhere. Some guests slumped where they sat, their heads nodding forward onto the wooden boards, asleep in the midst of noise as though the world itself had become too heavy to bear. Others staggered about the hall, weaving between benches, their voices raised in half-formed songs that blended into the roar of the crowd. Laughter came in sudden bursts, wild and hollow, followed just as quickly by curses shouted across the room. The polished rituals of the evening had unravelled entirely, leaving behind only raw instinct and intoxicated abandon. For many, the drink acted as a release, stripping away the rules that normally bound them. Servants and peasants, who in daylight kept their distance from nobility, found themselves emboldened, daring to clap their betters on the back, or to join in songs reserved for those above their station. Nobles too forgot their dignity, their fine clothes stained with drink as they stumbled like common men. The feast blurred the lines of class, but not with harmony. Instead, it became a swirling mix of disorder, where status and restraint dissolved in the flood of overflowing goblets. The chaos carried with it moments both comical and unsettling. A man might rise to dance, only to trip over his own feet and crash into a table, sending cups and trenchers flying. Another, seized by sudden inspiration, might stand atop a bench to deliver a speech so slurred and nonsensical that it drew both cheers and jeers. Women laughed loudly, their voices rising above the din, while children, long past bedtime, darted underfoot, swept up in the strange energy of the night. The hall had become less a place of celebration and more a theatre of excess, where each person played their part in the unfolding spectacle. Yet beneath the laughter lay a darker edge. Losing control in the chaos of drink could lead not only to foolishness, but to danger. Stumbling men collided with one another, and laughter turned quickly to shoving. Old grievances hidden beneath the mask of civility at the start of the feast now emerged with sharp tongues and clenched fists. The air was thick with unpredictability, the sense that anything might happen next, an embrace, a song, a brawl, or worse. The order of the feast had dissolved completely, replaced by a restless tide that no one could master. Still, for many, This loss of control was part of the very purpose of the feast. Life in the medieval world was harsh and demanding, each day filled with labour and restraint. The wedding banquet offered a rare chance to let go, to surrender to excess, even at the cost of dignity or safety. Guests sought not just food and drink but escape, and in the chaos of the hall they found it, however fleeting, however costly. By the time the torches burned low and the last songs gave way to muttered words, the feast was unrecognisable from its beginnings. The careful rituals, the solemn toasts, the blessings, all had been swept away by the current of drink. What remained was exhaustion, disorder, and the memory of a night that had slipped far beyond the control of its hosts. The chaos was not an accident but an inevitability, written into the very heart of the celebration. At a medieval wedding feast, there was little of the personal space or private dining that modern tables provide. Instead, the celebration was built on sharing, of benches, of food, of drink, and of tools. Guests sat pressed close upon long wooden boards, shoulders touching, elbows jostling, their laughter and words mingling in the thick, smoky air. Before them lay trenchers of bread, broad enough to hold meat and sauces, but never meant for one person alone. The act of eating was communal, and each mouthful tied one guest to another in ways both warm and perilous. Cups, for instance, rarely belonged to a single hand. A goblet of ale or wine, once lifted in toast, might pass around the table, each mouth taking its turn. What began at one end was swallowed at the other, the same rim brushed by dozens of lips. Wooden tankards, heavy and sloshing, were passed from one neighbour to the next, a gesture of fellowship, but also a silent exchange of much more than drink. To refuse a shared cup was considered rude, an insult to the giver's generosity, and so even the cautious drank, bound by the custom as tightly as by thirst. The knives, too, were shared. While nobles sometimes brought their own blades, many at the lower tables made do with what was available, carving meat from the same joint, tearing bread with the same edge. Hands moved quickly in the dim light, slicing portions that were handed across benches, dripping juices as they went. Each cut was a reminder of both necessity and danger, for knives were tools but also weapons, and in the closeness of the hall, the line between the two was uncomfortably thin. Platters of food travelled from table to table, carried by servants and grasped eagerly by hungry hands. A roasted bird, its skin glistening with fat, was set down at the centre of a board and pulled apart by those nearest, who passed portions along with little care for neatness. Fingers smeared with grease brushed against bread, sauces spilled across the rough wood, and bones were tossed aside onto the floor, where dogs and scraps mingled freely. What was eaten by one had been touched by many, the meal less a matter of personal taste than a shared tide of flavour and texture. This way of eating was not unusual but expected, a reflection of a world where resources were communal, and the bonds of society were reinforced in the very act of sharing. To sit at the same board, to drink from the same cup, was to affirm a place within the group, to be part of the circle of fellowship. Yet, for all its warmth, the practice carried risks that none could truly see. Illness passed easily along the rim of a cup, foodborne sickness spread quickly through a common platter, and tempers, already loosened by drink, were more likely to flare when knives were close at hand. Still, the sharing was as much symbolic as it was practical. A wedding was not meant to celebrate two individuals alone, but the joining of families, neighbours and allies. The shared trenchers, the circulating cups, the communal knives, all were silent reminders that no one lived alone, that every life was woven into the lives of others. Even as quarrels brewed and dangers lingered, the act of sharing was an affirmation of unity, however fragile, however fleeting. By the end of the night, when the platters lay empty and the cups rolled forgotten on the floor, the memory of sharing remained. Guests might wake the next day with headaches or fevers, but they would also remember the feel of crowded benches, the clatter of knives against bone, the warmth of hands passing food from one to another. In the medieval world, fellowship and risk were inseparable, and nowhere was that more visible than in the simple act of eating and drinking together. At a medieval wedding feast, the guests gathered around the tables with eager faces and hungry bellies, but one thing they seldom did before reaching for food was wash their hands. Soap was known, yes, and water was always near at wells or in buckets, but the act of cleansing before eating was not a firm expectation for most. A noble household might provide basins of scented water at the high table, poured gently by servants into silver bowls, yet such courtesies rarely extended to the lower boards, where peasants and lesser guests crowded together. For many, the thought of washing before a meal hardly crossed the mind. The feast itself demanded constant use of the hands. Knives, when shared, were often used for cutting, but much of the food was lifted directly by fingers, torn into portions and passed across the benches. Meat was grasped by the bone, bread was broken into hunks, and sauces were scooped up with crusts rather than spoons. In such a world, hands were both the primary tool of eating and the least attended to. What had touched the plough, the stable, the market, or the hearth only hours before now touched the food without pause. The wealthy might be offered a cloth to wipe their fingers, or even a sprig of herbs to freshen the hands, but these were tokens more of refinement than of hygiene. Among the broader company there was little thought given to invisible dirt or unseen dangers. Cleanliness was measured by appearance and scent rather than by hidden threats, and so long as one's hands did not look grimy, they were considered fit for use at the table. In the dim torchlight of the feast hall, with laughter echoing and music playing, few stopped to notice much at all. The effects of this neglect were often felt in the days that followed. Illnesses passed easily when food and fingers mingled so freely, spreading not only from spoiled dishes, but also from the hands that handled them. A man might wipe his mouth on his sleeve, tear bread with the same hand and pass it along, unaware that he was carrying more than generosity. Children, with their restless movements and sticky fingers, were especially careless, darting between tables and handling whatever caught their eye before, dropping it back among the food. Yet it would be wrong to think of this carelessness as simple ignorance. In the medieval mind, the dangers of dirt were not conceived in the same way as today. Illness was more often linked to bad air, sin, or curses than to unwashed hands. The idea that invisible agents could pass from skin to food was beyond the reach of understanding, and so customs reflected the knowledge of the time. Washing before meals was a mark of courtesy or of wealth, not of necessity. Still, there was an element of ritual in those rare moments when hand-washing was offered. To approach the basin, to have water poured over the fingers by a servant, to dry one's hands on a clean cloth. This was not simply about cleanliness but about status, a reminder of one's place in the hierarchy of the feast. The bride and groom, seated in honour, were most likely to enjoy this courtesy, while those at the far ends of the hall went without, their hands as they were when they arrived. By the close of the night, the absence of washing was forgotten amid the greater chaos, spilled drink, trampled food, and exhausted guests. Yet in the days that followed, when bellies turned sour and fevers spread, one could trace the unseen threads back to that moment, to fingers that had reached eagerly into shared platters without a thought for what they carried. It was a small detail in the grandeur of the feast, but one that lingered long after the music had faded. By the middle of the feast, when the first edge of hunger had been dulled and the tables were cluttered with scraps, another element of the medieval hall became impossible to ignore: the mess itself. A wedding banquet was not a place of neatness and careful plates, but of abundance, noise, and waste. Food was heaped high and torn apart with hands and knives. Bones were discarded onto the floor and spilled sauces pulled across the boards. Grease glistened under torchlight, coating trenches of bread in the fingers of guests alike, and into this lively chaos came the constant hum of flies, drawn as surely as the people were. Flies were an unwelcome but inevitable part of such gatherings. The smell of roasted meat and sweetened wine carried not only to the guests, but to every insect in the hall. With doors and windows open for air and smoke to escape, there was little to keep them out. They settled onto the platters, crawling across half-eaten joints of pork or roasted birds, dipping into sticky puddles of honeyed sauce. Guests brushed them away with hands already greasy, yet they returned, persistent and bold. For many, their presence was simply accepted, another reminder of the world outside pressing into the celebration. Dirt, too, found its way into the feast. Floors of beaten earth or rough stone quickly grew filthy as bones, shells and crusts were tossed aside, trodden underfoot by servants rushing to and fro. Dust rose from the stamping of feet during dances, settling again on food and goblets, left uncovered. Shoes muddied from the fields or the road carried the world outside straight into the hall, blending with the straw scattered across the floor to soak up spills. No matter how rich the decorations or how grand the occasion, the feast was grounded in this mixture of splendour and squalor, refinement layered upon raw earth. Grease, however, was everywhere, the most constant companion of medieval dining. Meat roasted on spits dripped with fat, collected in pans and poured over food to keep it moist. Hands tore through it, knives smeared it across bread, and trenchers soaked it until they softened and broke apart. Guests licked their fingers or wiped them on their tunics, leaving stains that marked them long after the meal was over. To modern eyes, the greasiness might seem overwhelming, but for those present it was a sign of richness, of plenty, of a feast worthy of memory. Together, the flies, dirt and grease formed part of the sensory tapestry of the celebration. The hall was not merely a place of eating, but of sensation. The buzz of insects, the stickiness of fingers, the gritty crunch of straw underfoot, the sharp scent of smoke mingling with the sweetness of spilled wine. Each bite carried more than flavour. It carried the texture of the hall itself, the mingling of abundance and imperfection. Guests noticed, perhaps, but did not linger on it. Hunger and merriment drowned such thoughts as quickly as they arose. Yet the consequences lingered beyond the night. What was swallowed with food was not always wholesome, and the memory of flavours was sometimes followed by days of discomfort or worse. But this was not enough to dampen the spirit of the feast. Life was lived close to the earth, and with that closeness came acceptance of its untidiness. Flies, dirt and grease were not intruders but companions of every meal, reminders that even in celebration, the rawness of daily life was never far away. And so the guests ate, laughed, and drank on, brushing away flies, smearing grease across bread, stepping over bones and scraps as though it were all part of the ritual. For in truth, it was. The imperfections were as much a part of the medieval feast as the music and the merriment, woven inseparably into the memory of every bite. While the tables groaned under the weight of food and the air swelled with the smell of grease and smoke, another layer of noise filled the medieval wedding hall, the endless stream of music, performance, and laughter supplied by minstrels and jesters. Their presence was as essential to the feast as the meat and wine, for no celebration was complete without entertainment. The hosts expected the hall to be alive not only with eating and drinking, but with sound. Lutes strummed, fiddles scraped, tambourines rattled, and voices rose in song, all tumbling together in a restless chorus. The minstrels stood or sat near the high table, where their music would reach both nobles and common guests. Their instruments were simple by modern standards, but capable of filling the hall. The twang of stringed lutes, the reedy sigh of shams, the beat of small drums that kept time with clapping hands. They sang of knights and battles, of love both loyal and betrayed, weaving tales that echoed above the chatter of guests. Their voices had to be strong, for the feast was loud, and their audience only half attentive, more interested in drink than in ballads. Yet they played on, knowing that their craft was measured not in silence won but in keeping the night alive. Alongside them came the jesters, brightly dressed in motley colours, bells jingling with each step. They thrived on mischief, slipping between the tables, mocking noble and peasant alike, their jokes pointed but softened with laughter. A guest caught dozing at the table might find a jester tugging his sleeve or placing a fool's cap upon his head to the delight of onlookers. Others were coaxed into impromptu dances or mocked for their greedy reach toward the platters. In a world where hierarchy was rigid, the jester was granted rare license to speak boldly, to laugh at those who could not otherwise be laughed at. Noisy songs followed wherever jesters and minstrels roamed. Some were bawdy, filled with playful verses that drew loud cheers and knowing glances. Others were drinking songs, their refrains simple enough for the whole hall to join in. As goblets overflowed, voices grew louder, each guest convinced of their own tunefulness, though the result was a muddle of sound that shook the rafters. The songs did not need to be pretty, they were meant to bind the guests together, to drown out the quarrels and fill the silence with a roar of shared joy. The music and laughter, however, could be overwhelming. The hall was already thick with the clatter of knives, the scrape of benches, and the buzz of conversation. To this was added the jangle of bells, the clash of instruments, the rise and fall of voices shouting above the din. It was not harmony, but a kind of storm. a wall of sound that pressed upon every guest. For some, the noise was exhilarating, a sign that life still burned bright into the late hours. For others, it was exhausting, leaving them dazed beneath the ceaseless assault of sound. And yet, without minstrels, jesters, and noisy songs, the feast would have felt empty. Silence was the mark of solemnity or mourning, not of joy. A wedding demanded sound, sound that carried into the night, sound that spilled from the hall into the village beyond, announcing to all who could hear that love and union were being celebrated. The performers ensured that no corner of the feast fell quiet, that the air itself was thick with motion and mirth. By the time the torches burned low, the songs were ragged, the jesters weary, the minstrels' fingers sore. Still they played and jested on, their work unending until the last guest stumbled from the hall. For the medieval feast was not simply a meal, it was a performance, a spectacle of sight, taste, and above all sound. The minstrels, jesters, and noisy songs were the heartbeat of that spectacle, driving the celebration forward long after order had been lost. As the minstrels played on and the jesters pranced between benches, yet another layer of entertainment unfolded, acts so strange and wondrous that they hovered somewhere between spectacle and cruelty. Among these were the performances of animals brought into the wedding hall, creatures dressed and trained to amuse the crowd with tricks that blurred the line between marvel and mockery. In the flickering torchlight, a bear might shuffle on its hind legs, tugged along by a chain, or a monkey in miniature garments might leap from table to table, snatching morsels to the laughter of the guests. Such sights were not unusual in medieval celebrations. Travelling performers carried with them not only instruments and costumes, but also animals that could be coaxed into mimicry of human gestures. A dog might be taught to bow, a goat to balance upon a platform, or a small horse to prance as though dancing to the beat of the drum. The crowd welcomed these diversions, their attention drawn from the endless clamour of feasting to the curious spectacle of beasts behaving almost like men. The louder the laughter, the more coins the handlers might collect from nobles eager to show generosity before their peers. Yet beneath the surface of merriment lay a harsher truth. The animals were not willing partners in these displays. Bears were muzzled, their teeth blunted or removed, their steps guided by whips or chains. Monkeys were tethered, their antics forced by fear of punishment more than by instinct. Even birds were sometimes brought into the hall, their wings clipped so that they fluttered helplessly in mock battles staged for the crowd's amusement. To modernise, such performances would appear cruel, but in the medieval feast they were greeted with delight, for the discomfort of beasts mattered little beside the hunger for novelty. The noise of the hall grew sharper when such acts began. Children squealed as the monkey clambered across the backs of benches, stealing bread from the hands of guests who laughed rather than scolded. Men shouted encouragement as a bear stumbled through awkward steps, its chain pulled tight to keep it upright. At times the animals were made part of the jesters' routines, mocked and jeered at as though they too were fools dressed for the amusement of their betters. The line between human and beast blurred in the laughter, both treated as players in the same restless play. For the guests, the spectacle was more than entertainment. It was also a reflection of power. To command beasts to dance or bow was a symbol of man's dominion over the natural world. Nobles saw in the trembling bear or the capering dog a mirror of their own authority, the ability to bend even nature itself into service. In a hall where hierarchy defined every seat and gesture, even the animals were drawn into the performance of order, their humiliation woven into the fabric of celebration. Still, there must have been moments of unease. The chained bear was dangerous, its strength only half tamed, and the handlers kept a wary eye as the crowd pressed close. The monkey's teeth were sharp, and its darting leaps could turn from amusing to threatening in an instant. Laughter carried a nervous edge, for the feast was not only joy but risk, each spectacle balanced between delight and danger. When the acts ended, the animals were led away, their chains rattling into the night. The guests turned back to their wine, their meat, their noisy songs, carrying with them the memory of strange tricks that added yet another layer of wonder to the overwhelming chaos of the feast. To modern imagination, the sight of dancing animals seems unsettling, but for the medieval wedding it was simply part of the tapestry, a fleeting moment of marvel that ensured no guest, however weary, would forget the night. When the music of the minstrels quieted for a moment, and the jesters had exhausted their laughter, Another kind of entertainment stepped forward, one far louder, sharper, and infinitely more perilous. In the wide space cleared at the centre of the hall, men took up swords, staves, or even daggers, their polished blades gleaming in the firelight. These contests were as much about pride as performance, a chance for warriors, squires, and bold-hearted guests to display their skill before an eager crowd. Sword games were not always meant to end in blood. Often they were demonstrations, a kind of play fight where steel clashed in quick ringing blows and sparks leapt from edges. The hall echoed with the crack and clang of a weapon striking together, the rhythm of combat weaving itself into the tapestry of sound. The crowd leaned forward on benches, goblets paused halfway to their lips, as they watched the swift movements of fighters weaving and circling beneath the smoky rafters. For a wedding was not merely a feast of food and song. It was also a stage for bravery, a reminder that martial strength still defined a man's honour. The contests varied in form. Sometimes it was two young squires, urged on by their lords, showing their training before an approving audience. At other times, more seasoned men took the floor, their movements heavier, their strikes fiercer, the danger far more real. The line between sport and combat was thin, and though these games were meant to amuse, they could turn violent in an instant. A misjudged swing, a slip on the greasy floor, and suddenly a cut was deeper than intended, the laughter at the tables faltering as red spilled across the rushes. For the guests, the thrill was part of the appeal. Danger was woven into the very fabric of medieval life, and to see men risk themselves for spectacle was no stranger than seeing animals dance or jesters mock. The flash of blades, the rush of movement, the chance that one fighter might fall, it was excitement enough to lift weary eyes after hours of feasting. Some cheered loudly, calling out encouragement to favoured contestants. Others watched in silence, their faces lit by the fire's glow, caught between fascination and unease. Beyond swords, other contests were staged. Archery demonstrations, where arrows hissed toward targets set against the far wall. Wrestling bouts, where men grappled in the straw-strewn floor, their shouts drowned in the roar of the crowd. Even knife-throwing, with blades thudding into wooden boards set perilously close to bystanders. Each contest carried the scent of risk, the possibility that celebration could tip suddenly into chaos. And in truth, that was part of what kept the hall alive. No one knew whether the night would end with laughter or with blood. For the bride and groom, seated in honour at the high table, these displays carried symbolic weight. The swords raised in contest could be seen as vows of loyalty, reminders that warriors would fight to defend their lord's house, just as they fought now for applause. In a world where war was never far, martial games were not mere diversions, but echoes of the struggles that defined daily life. To ignore the presence of danger in a wedding feast would have been to ignore the reality of the age itself. When the contest ended, weapons lowered and fighters bowed. The hall filled again with noise, cheers, laughter, the rattle of goblets lifted in toasts. Yet the air carried a sharper edge, a memory of steel slicing the smoky haze, of men's lives balanced between play and peril. Sword games and dangerous contests left the crowd restless, thrilled, unsettled, but above all awake, their hearts stirred amid the endless tide of feasting. As the night wore on, and the wedding hall swelled with wine, laughter, and the pounding rhythm of drums, another current stirred beneath the merriment, an undercurrent of memory, pride, and long-held resentments. A medieval feast gathered not only family and friends, but also rivals, neighbours, and men who carried histories of insult or loss. And when they sat side by side at long, crowded tables, with wine flowing too freely and voices raised too loud, those old grudges, once hidden, had a way of slipping back into the light. At first it began with words, a glance too sharp, a toast spoken with mocking emphasis, a jest that carried an edge sharper than the blade at one's hip. Two men who had quarrelled over land might find themselves seated across from one another, their eyes meeting over a platter of roasted meat. The silence between them weighted with years of bitterness. Another might recall a debt unpaid, a promise broken, or an insult whispered at some long-forgotten gathering. The feast was meant to unite, yet its crowded tables and flowing goblets sometimes became the very stage for old disputes to breathe again. Wine loosened tongues, and restraint was easily lost. A man already flushed with drink might raise his voice, recalling some ancient slight. Another, unwilling to appear weak before peers, would answer in kind. Soon the words sharpened into accusations, laughter around them dying as the tension thickened. At times, jesters tried to smooth the mood, turning quarrels into jokes, but not every anger could be disguised as play. A feast, so loud and chaotic, gave cover for such confrontations, and the air was often thick with murmurs of rising tempers. The dangers were real. A hand might slam upon the table, rattling cups and scattering crumbs. A knife, meant for carving meat, could become a weapon if patience slipped too far. Guests near the quarrel would shift uneasily, unsure whether to intervene or step aside. The hall that had moments before been filled with song and laughter could turn in an instant into a place of threat, where the shadow of violence crept across the flickering firelight. These grudges were rarely small. In a world where honour was fiercely guarded and insults rarely forgotten, every slight carried weight. A wrong glance at a tournament, a disputed boundary stone, an old rivalry between families, all could fester for years, waiting only for the right spark. A wedding, with its abundance of wine and its crowded hall, provided the perfect tinder, and though the hosts hoped for harmony, they could never truly keep bitterness from walking through the door with the guests. At times, peacekeepers would rise, an elder relative stepping between two men, a priest reminding them of the sanctity of the occasion, or the groom himself imploring for calm. But not all quarrels could be silenced. Some burned too hot, forcing one man to leave the table in shame or another to storm from the hall, his pride unwilling to bow, even for the sake of celebration. And sometimes, though less often blood was spilled, a feast remembered not for joy but for the moment anger boiled into violence. When such storms passed, the hall struggled to regain its rhythm. Music resumed, goblets were lifted once more, and jesters danced to ease the unease. Yet beneath the laughter lingered a tension, the knowledge that beneath the surface of merriment lay the fragile truth of human pride. Old grudges, even when quiet again, left a shadow on the feast, reminding all who sat at the table that joy and discord were never far apart in a medieval hall. At a medieval wedding feast, the tables were not only laden with food, but also with pride, ambition, and the ever-present need to be seen. In a world where reputation shaped one's place in society, a great gathering such as this became more than a celebration. It was a stage. Every guest, from the humblest squire to the most decorated knight, felt the pull to prove his worth, to shine in the crowded hall, to ensure that his name was remembered long after the torches burned out. This competition for honour began subtly. A knight might rise for a toast, his voice carrying across the tables, not only to bless the bride and groom, but to remind all of his victories in past battles. Another might present a lavish gift, more costly than the rest, his gesture calculated to draw whispers of admiration from the crowd. Even the way a guest dressed could be a silent contest. Rich brocades, jewelled clasps, and feathered hats flaunted wealth as much as loyalty. In a society where appearances carried weight, every detail was a statement, and no one wished to appear lesser beside his peers. For warriors, the competition often spilled into demonstrations of skill. Sword games and contests, already dangerous enough, became opportunities to prove courage and strength. A fighter who struck with precision, who carried himself with confidence, might secure the admiration of lords and ladies alike. Others, unwilling to be overshadowed, pressed themselves forward, sometimes recklessly for fear of seeming weak. Each clang of steel was not only for entertainment but also for reputation. Each gesture a declaration. I am worthy of honour, I am worthy of notice. The rivalry extended beyond the men. Among the noblewomen present, displays of beauty and grace carried their own silent weight. The choice of gowns, the sparkle of jewels, the poise of movement, all were observed, compared, and whispered about. A lady who shone brightest in the torchlight might secure the admiration of nobles, and perhaps strengthen her family's standing through the bonds of attention and favour. In the medieval world, honour was not only a matter of the battlefield, but of the hall, where influence was cultivated in glances and conversations. Yet with so many striving for notice, tensions grew. A boast made too loudly could provoke resentment. A gift too grand might embarrass another who could, not match it. When pride met pride, sparks ignited. and what began as competition could slide into rivalry. The hall, already thick with noise, grew sharper with undercurrents of jealousy and one-upmanship, each man or woman determined not to be forgotten in the shadow of another. The bride and groom themselves often became the unspoken measure of these contests. To be noticed by them, to earn a smile, a nod, or a word of praise, was a prize worth striving for. Some guests angled their stories and gestures toward the high table, ensuring their names reached noble ears. Others fought for the eyes of the wider crowd, knowing that in such gatherings, alliances were made as quickly as reputations could be tarnished. When the night drew on, and wine loosened restraint, the competition grew bolder. Guests sang louder, toasted longer, boasted more extravagantly. Some leapt into dancing with wild energy, determined to outlast or outshine their rivals on the floor. The feast became not only a celebration but a contest of endurance, pride, and presence. The hall itself seemed to pulse with the restless hunger of men and women who could not bear to fade into the background. In the end, only a few succeeded in standing out, their deeds or gestures remembered when the night was retold in stories. But for many the struggle itself was the point, the chance to fight for honour in a hall where every eye might be watching. And so, beneath the laughter and music, the medieval wedding feast was also a quiet battlefield of pride, where victory was measured not in blood but in memory. As the night deepened and the torches burned low, the great hall of a medieval wedding often carried with it a strange tension, a mingling of merriment and unease. What had begun as a celebration of union, marked by music, feasting, and laughter, sometimes ended in something far darker. The very abundance that filled the tables, the endless flow of wine, the crush of rival guests, and the sharp edge of long-held grudges could turn joy into fury. More than once a wedding feast closed not with songs and blessings, but with violence, and on rare but memorable occasions with blood spilled upon the rushes. The seeds of such chaos were sown long before the first goblet was raised. Medieval society was built upon honour and pride, fragile currencies that were defended fiercely and surrendered never. When men of different families, lands and allegiances were forced into close quarters, sitting shoulder to shoulder in a hall thick with noise and wine, it was almost inevitable that tempers would flare. A careless jest, a mocking glance, or an old insult resurrected in the heat of drink could unravel the fragile fabric of harmony. The violence might begin suddenly, with a shout and the clatter of a bench overturned. A knife meant for carving meat could flash in anger, or a goblet be hurled across the table in drunken fury. What began as a quarrel between two men might quickly draw others in, friends, kin, or allies unwilling to see their honour slighted. Soon the hall was no longer a place of feasting, but of chaos, where laughter was drowned in the din of struggle and the cries of alarm. In the cramped space of the feast, weapons were never far away. Many guests carried swords at their sides as a matter of custom, and once drawn, steel had a way of multiplying conflict. A single cut could turn a quarrel into a brawl into a melee, until the air was filled with the ring of blades and the sharp smell of blood mingling with wine and smoke. Women and children shrank back from the tables, the joyous decorations of the hall now a backdrop to fear. The hosts, bride and groom, their families, their servants, would rush to restore order, but even noble authority struggled to calm men once anger had taken root. Priests lifted their voices, pleading for peace in the name of God, but words were weak against the roar of human pride. A feast meant to bind families together could instead fracture them further, leaving wounds both physical and lasting. Stories linger of weddings remembered not for the vows spoken, but for the violence that followed. In some, a single death stained the night forever, the memory of blood marking what should have been a day of joy. In others, whole rivalries were reignited, feasts ending with armed men spilling into the streets, their quarrels carried far beyond the hall. The very abundance of a medieval wedding, the crowded hall, the flowing wine, the mingling of too many tempers, created the perfect storm for such endings. And yet, for all the risks, people continued to gather, to feast, to celebrate as though joy and blood were simply two faces of the same coin. The medieval wedding was a mirror of the age itself, rich, noisy, restless, and unpredictable. To sit at the tables of such a feast was to step into a world where union and division, laughter and violence could exist side by side, and where no guest could be certain how the night would end. When the first goblets were lifted and the first platters carried into the hall, the night was still young, the torches tall, and the laughter fresh. Yet a medieval wedding feast was not measured in hours as modern celebrations might be, neatly bound to an evening. Instead, it was an ordeal of endurance, a procession of courses, toasts, songs, contests, and dances that rolled forward almost without pause. To attend such a feast was to surrender oneself to the tide of noise, food, and wine that surged on until the darkness outside gave way to the pale light of dawn. The meal itself unfolded slowly, layer upon layer. Great joints of roasted meat were brought first, then stews rich with spice, then fish, poultry, pies, puddings, and sweetmeats. Each course seemed final until the next appeared, carried in by servants whose arms must have ached from the endless procession. Goblets were never allowed to run dry, refilled by eager hands who saw it as their duty to keep the guests flushed and merry. The table never emptied. It shifted constantly, as if the hall itself had no end to its bounty. Between the courses came music, jesting, contests of arms, and wild performances, each interlude stretching the night further. A guest might think the feast was closing, only for another song to rise, another toast to be declared, another dish to appear steaming in the torchlight. Time itself seemed to soften, unmarked by hours but measured instead by the growing weariness of limbs, the blurring of voices, the dull ache of a body made heavy with food and drink. As midnight deepened, the hall grew hotter, louder, and more unsteady. Benches creaked under the shifting weight of dozing guests, while others, too stubborn to yield, shouted louder, sang harder, or raised their cups with unsteady hands. The air was thick with smoke and the mingled sense of grease and sweat. A strange rhythm took hold. The feast swelled with noise, dipped into a brief lull when a few fell silent, then surged again as another song or quarrel broke out. Sleep was not permitted, at least not until exhaustion claimed the body entirely. For servants, the ordeal was greater still. They moved constantly between kitchen and hall, carrying trays, wiping spills, pouring wine, and keeping watch against quarrels that might spill into violence. Their nights stretched longer than any noble's, for their work began long before the feast, and ended only when the last guest stumbled away, or when dawn's light crept across the tables strewn with scraps and overturned goblets. And when dawn finally came, it arrived not with silence, but with the slow unwinding of chaos. Some guests, too weary or too drunk to leave, slept where they sat, their heads resting on the greasy boards of the table. Others staggered into the morning air, blinking against the pale sun, their laughter hoarse and broken. The bride and groom, exhausted yet bound by ceremony, were often expected to appear still smiling to greet the day that marked the beginning of their marriage. To survive such a feast demanded stamina beyond ordinary measure. The endless food weighed upon the stomach, the relentless wine clouded the mind, the ceaseless noise wore down the senses. By the time dawn broke, joy was mingled with exhaustion, memory blurred by too many hours of indulgence. A medieval wedding feast was not a single meal, but a trial, a celebration stretched into an ordeal that consumed the entire night. For those who endured it, the rising sun was both a relief and a reminder. The feast had ended, but its mark remained, on the body, in the head, in the stories that would be told long after. To sit through such hours of feasting was to learn that in the medieval world, joy itself could be overwhelming, a test as much as a celebration, stretching on until the world outside had already begun another day. Behind the glow of torchlight and the clamour of song, the medieval wedding feast carried with it a reality often forgotten in the romance of memory. The bitter cold that clung to the great halls and tents where celebrations took place. For no matter how many torches burned, how many braziers smoked, or how tightly bodies pressed together, the draught of night air was always present. Guests feasted in spaces where warmth was fleeting, where the stone of the hall or the canvas of the tent held the chill of the season, and where the joy of the moment had to contend with the bite of the cold. Great stone halls, impressive to behold, were built for strength, not comfort. Their walls rose thick and tall, but they held the night air as much as they kept it out. Windows, narrow and unglazed, were often shuttered with wood, yet cracks let in the wind that whistled through the rafters. The floor, strewn with rushes, could not hold warmth, and the cold of the earth beneath crept upward. Even with braziers glowing red and torches spitting smoke, warmth never fully spread. Guests close to the fire might have flushed cheeks, but those seated farther away wrapped cloaks tightly about their shoulders, their breath faintly visible in the torchlight. When the feast spilled beyond the hall into large tents raised for the occasion, the discomfort grew sharper still. Canvas walls flapped and strained in the wind, their seams rattling as night pressed in. Straw was scattered to keep the damp from rising, yet moisture seeped upward, chilling feet and hems. Torches and braziers struggled against the vast emptiness, their warmth stolen almost as quickly as it was given. Guests huddled close, laughing and toasting loudly to distract from the shiver running beneath their merriment. Clothing offered some defence, though not all were equally protected. Nobles wore layers of wool, fur-lined cloaks, and heavy mantles clasped with brooches of silver and gold. Their garments provided both warmth and a show of wealth, though even the richest furs could not fully silence the cold. The poor and humble guests fared worse, clad in rough wool and patched cloaks that left them vulnerable to every draught. To them, the feast was both blessing and burden. Food in plenty, yet a night spent in bone-deep chill. The cold shaped the rhythm of the feast itself. Guests lingered near the fires, clustering until the press of bodies grew uncomfortable, then shifting back into the draught once more. Cups of hot spiced wine, known as hippocras, were more than a luxury. They were a small defence against the night air. Musicians played with stiffened fingers, their instruments sometimes straining in the chill, while jesters stamped their feet between acts to keep blood flowing. Even the bride and groom, adorned in their finest, could not wholly escape the creeping cold beneath silks and brocade. And so, beneath the appearance of abundance and joy, every guest carried the quiet discomfort of a body fighting against the air of the hall or tent. The feast was not only a trial of endurance against food, drink and noise, but against the season itself. For hours upon hours, men and women sat shivering, their laughter mingled with the faint rattle of teeth, their revelry layered with the ache of chill bones. By the time dawn broke, the cold felt deeper still, for fatigue stripped away the strength that had kept it at bay. Guests staggered into the grey morning, cloaks pulled tight, feet numb, hearts weary. They had celebrated, but they had also endured. The freezing halls and draughty tents were part of the truth of a medieval feast, grand, abundant, unforgettable, and yet always shadowed by the relentless chill of a world where warmth was rare and fleeting. As the long night wore on, the wedding feast became not only a celebration but a trial of endurance. Hours of eating, drinking, laughing and enduring the bitter cold took their toll. By the time the first pale hints of dawn crept into the hall, fatigue pressed down upon the guests like a heavy cloak. What had begun in joy and noise ended in weariness, with men and women collapsing wherever they could, too exhausted to care about comfort or formality. The hall, so alive with music and merriment at sunset, transformed into a place of stillness, punctuated by uneven snores and the occasional groan of a body shifting on the hard floor. Benches that had once been crowded with guests now held slumped figures, heads resting awkwardly on arms. Others slid beneath the tables, curling into the straw and rushes as though the rough ground were a bed. Cloaks became blankets, sleeves became pillows, and proximity to the fire determined who found a little warmth and who shivered in restless sleep. For the nobles, collapsing in exhaustion was not much more graceful. Heavy garments weighed upon tired bodies, jewels pressed into skin, and elaborate headdresses became burdens that toppled as heads drooped forward. Some retreated to side chambers or hastily prepared pallets, but many did not make it so far. They lay sprawled among servants and lesser, guests, rank and station forgotten in the haze of fatigue. The divisions of the feast blurred as bodies rested side by side, united by nothing more than the shared need for sleep. Tents outside the hall told the same story. Their canvas walls, flapping in the night breeze, sheltered men and women who could no longer keep themselves upright. Groups huddled together against the cold, drifting into uneasy slumber. The straw laid upon the ground became a makeshift bed for dozens, the damp earth beneath soaking slowly through. Yet no one complained. Sleep came as a mercy, however rough its form. The exhaustion was not simply from the hour, but from the relentless pace of the feast itself. Endless courses of food had burdened the body, and strong drink had dulled the senses. The music, the noise, the quarrels and laughter, all had worn down minds and limbs. Guests reached a point where no amount of merriment could sustain them, and the only path forward was surrender. Eyes closed mid-sentence, goblets slipped from limp hands, and once lively conversations trailed into silence, as one by one the revellers succumbed. Fatigue gave the hall a strange, dreamlike atmosphere. The torches burned low, their flames sputtering, filling the space with a smoky haze. Shadows stretched across the walls, moving with the last flickers of fire. Amid these shadows lay the bodies of the exhausted, a crowd of fine clothes and weary faces, their earlier laughter now replaced by the deep rhythm of sleep. It was a kind of surrender that seemed both vulnerable and inevitable, as if the feast itself demanded its price in exhaustion. By morning, the hall was a portrait of aftermath. Spilled wine stained the rushes, crumbs and bones littered the tables, and scattered guests lay wherever they had fallen. Servants moved quietly among them, stoking fires, clearing dishes, careful not to wake the heavy sleepers. The celebration was not over, but its energy had passed, leaving behind only the image of men and women utterly spent. In this way, the medieval wedding feast always revealed its truest end, not in ceremony, not in song, but in the collapse of the human body. For no matter the wealth of the tables, the noise of the music, or the warmth of the fire, fatigue triumphed. Guests lay in awkward heaps, asleep amid the remnants of abundance, their bodies surrendering where their spirits had danced only hours before. The exhaustion that swept over the wedding guests did not end with sleep alone. The aftermath of a medieval feast often carried with it quiet dangers, risks that seemed small in the moment but grew heavier with time. In the crowded halls and tents, with smoke in the air and food lying uncovered, sickness travelled swiftly. What appeared to be simple weariness could transform into fever, stomach cramps or worse, leaving behind memories far darker than the joy of the celebration. The food itself was one of the greatest risks. Preservation methods were crude, and even the finest kitchens struggled to keep meat fresh, especially when prepared in great quantities for hundreds of guests. Dishes sat out for hours, exposed to smoke, flies, and the warmth of fires. Spices and sauces disguised the taste of decay, but did little to prevent the illness that might follow. By morning, it was not unusual for several guests to wake with aching heads and unsettled stomachs, not merely from drink, but from food that their bodies could not endure. The closeness of the feast also carried its own dangers. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people pressed together in a single hall, passing cups, knives, and platters from hand to hand. In such conditions, coughs and fevers spread easily. A single sick guest might unknowingly pass an illness to dozens more. What began as a joyous union of families could, within days, become remembered as the moment an entire village fell ill. In a world without modern medicine, even the smallest sickness could be feared, for recovery was never certain. Nor were physical injuries uncommon. The heavy drinking that marked many weddings often ended in quarrels, and quarrels easily became brawls. A jest misunderstood, a slight at the table, or a long-held grudge revived by wine could result in fists, knives, or even swords being drawn. In the dim light of torches amid slippery floors and crowded benches, accidents multiplied. Guests stumbled, tripped, or fell against the fire. Cuts and bruises were frequent souvenirs of such nights, accepted as the price of revelry. The entertainers too sometimes added to the risk. Swordplay and dangerous contests were meant to thrill, but they brought hazards as well. A blade swung too wide, a horse startled in the courtyard, or a trick gone wrong could turn delight into injury in a moment. The audience laughed at daring displays, but beneath the laughter was a thin thread of unease, for everyone knew that risk was never far from amusement. Even the exhaustion itself carried dangers. Guests who collapsed near the fire risked smouldering cloaks, or burns from falling embers. Others who slept in the coldest corners of draughty halls might wake with chills that settled into lingering sickness. The body, already strained by long hours of noise, heavy food, and strong drink, became vulnerable. What was meant as a night of unity often left people weakened, their defences lowered against the hardships of the season. For all these reasons, a medieval wedding feast was remembered with both joy and caution. It was a night of laughter and abundance, but also one where the fragility of human health was on full display. Behind the noise and brilliance, the risks of sickness or injury lingered, quiet but ever present, reminding all who attended that celebration and danger were never far apart in the medieval world. As the night deepened and the wine flowed without measure, the atmosphere of the wedding feast often shifted. What began as joyful laughter and playful teasing could easily tip into quarrels, and once quarrels began, they rarely remained small. In the smoky glow of torchlight, amid the clutter of overturned cups and half-eaten platters, drunken tempers sparked like dry wood catching fire. And in such a crowded hall, it was almost impossible for an innocent guest to remain untouched by the chaos. Many guests entered the feast already carrying old grievances. Perhaps two families had argued over land, or a pair of men had competed for the same woman in years past. Wine loosened tongues and blurred judgment, and soon small slights, a mocking laugh, a boast too loudly spoken, were taken as insults. The clash might begin with words, but words quickly gave way to shoving and shoving to fists. The noise of merriment became noise of struggle, as benches scraped, goblets spilled, and servants scattered to avoid the rising storm. For those not involved, there was little chance of escape. The halls were crowded with bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. When two men began to fight, those around them were drawn into the circle whether they wished it or not. A swinging fist did not ask permission, and a toppled table sent dishes crashing into laps. Even those who tried to keep their peace found themselves caught between flailing arms, or struck by accident in the confusion. To sit quietly was no protection when the air itself seemed to ripple with aggression. The weapons of the feast were not always intended as such, but they became dangerous when tempers rose. Knives used to carve meat were suddenly brandished as threats. Heavy cups became blunt instruments. Even the long wooden benches, when overturned, trapped guests beneath or sent them sprawling. A single quarrel could turn a joyful gathering into a scene of chaos, where laughter was replaced by cries and curses echoing beneath the rafters. In the dim light, the scene took on a strange, almost unreal quality. Shadows of grappling figures stretched against the walls, distorted by firelight. The music, once lively, faltered as minstrels stepped back in fear, their instruments falling silent. Servants huddled in corners, unsure whether to intervene or wait until the storm passed. And through it all, those who had come only to celebrate were pulled into a battle not of their making, marked by bruises, torn clothing, and the sour sting of spilt wine. What made such brawls most unsettling was their unpredictability. No one knew when the moment would arrive, nor how far it would spread. A jest might pass harmlessly one night, yet on another night the same words might draw blood. The line between celebration and violence was thin, and to attend a wedding feast was always to walk that line, never certain when joy would dissolve into struggle. By morning, the aftermath told its own story. Tables stood crooked, the rushes were stained with drink and blood, and some guests carried home more than memories. They carried the marks of bruises and the aches of unintended battles. Few admitted openly how frightening it had been, for to confess fear was to lose face. Yet the truth remained. In the whirl of medieval celebration, to be caught in a drunken brawl was as common as laughter itself, a risk every guest knew, though few ever spoke of it aloud. When the echoes of music and quarrels finally faded, and the guests lay scattered across benches, straw and cold earth, sleep came not as gentle rest, but as a heavy, uneasy fog. The body, strained by hours of eating, drinking, shouting and stumbling, found no true comfort. And so, as dawn crept into the smoky hall, the waking hours carried with them a different sort of trial, one of weakness, nausea, and lingering pain. The first light of morning revealed a hall in disarray. The rushes on the floor were soaked with wine and grease. The air was thick with the scent of stale smoke and spoiled meat, and bodies still lay where they had fallen in the night. Slowly, one by one, the sleepers stirred. A man rolled from a bench with a groan, clutching his head. A woman pushed herself upright only to collapse back down, too faint to rise. The sounds of laughter and music were gone, replaced by coughing, retching, and the low moans of those who regretted the night's excess. For many, the hangover was as much a part of the feast as the dancing itself. Strong wines and ales had been poured in endless measure, and few refused the constant toasts. By morning, mouths were dry, stomachs churned, and temples throbbed with a relentless ache. Water was not always clean, and so there was little to soothe the thirst except more ale, which only deepened the fog of fatigue. Some tried to eat bread to settle their stomachs, but even the simplest bite felt heavy and unkind. Others suffered not from drink alone, but from the food itself. Rich meats, often poorly preserved and hastily cooked, lingered in the stomach like unwelcome guests. Stomachs cramped, fevers rose, and some lay doubled over with sickness that would last far beyond the wedding day. In an age without remedies beyond herbs and prayers, such illness could become dangerous, even deadly. What was meant as a celebration of life and union could, for the unlucky, mark the beginning of decline. The weakness touched everyone, noble and peasant alike. A knight might find his limbs too heavy to lift his sword, while a farmer might stagger as though drunk even after the wine had left his body. Crowns and jewels did little to protect the body from the weight of indulgence. Side by side, great lords and humble servants alike shared the same pale faces, the same dull eyes, the same unsteady steps. In the morning light, the divisions of rank seemed blurred, replaced by the common frailty of overindulgence. The atmosphere of the morning was strangely quiet, almost sombre. Servants moved carefully through the hall, clearing dishes and stoking fires, their footsteps muffled by the bodies still sprawled across the floor. The cheer of the previous day seemed distant, as though it belonged to another world. Instead, there was only the soft shuffle of movement, the occasional sound of someone rushing outside to be sick, and the heavy silence of people too weak to speak. And yet this too was part of the ritual of the wedding feast. The night brought joy, laughter, music, and excess, while the morning brought weariness, regret, and sickness. Both were woven into the memory of the occasion, inseparable from one another. To wake weak, sick, or hungover was not seen as failure, but as proof that one had taken part fully in the celebration. In this way, the wedding feast lingered far beyond its hours of merriment. The taste of meat, the sting of wine, the pounding in the head, these were the echoes that followed guests into the next day, reminders that joy in the medieval world often walked hand in hand with suffering.